Welcome once again to Roundtable. I'm Bob Orr of the Press Club of Southwest Florida, and today we're tackling the contentious issue of guns, gun-related violence, and gun safety reforms. We've seen more than 50 mass shootings just since April the 1st. The president is now calling for new regulations, and polls show a majority of Americans, by a large number, favor banning assault-style weapons and large-capacity magazines. People also would like to see universal background checks. Retired journalists Mark Young and Larry Doyle will join me in questioning our two special guests. We will hear from Luis Valdes, a former police officer who is now the State of Florida Director for Gun Owners of America. Luis is a staunch defender of the Second Amendment and says that gun rights cannot be limited in any way. But first, we're going to be talking to Fred Guttenberg, a former Miami area businessman whose daughter Jamie was among the 17 people who were killed in the 2018 shootings at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Mr. Guttenberg has now adopted gun safety as his life's mission. We welcome now to Roundtable Fred Guttenberg. Fred, nice that you could join us. Thank you for taking some time.
Thank you for having me.
We obviously, as a press club, would like to express our condolences to the loss of your daughter. We admire your courage in speaking out on this very controversial issue. So thank you for that as well. I guess what I'd like to know, in the 3+ years now since the Parkland shootings where Jamie was killed,
Sure.
you've dedicated your life to gun safety reform. Do you feel like you're making progress?
Oh, absolutely. Listen, when my daughter was killed and I threw myself into this, people told me I was wasting my time, that you can't change this. But the truth is, since then, we have broken the gun lobby. We've broken their grip on legislators. The 2018 election, the House flipped, and I would argue in large part on this issue. In the 2020 election, the presidency flipped and the Senate flipped, and this was a top voting issue. When you look at states across the country, there are many states that are doing amazing work. There are also some states that predictably are going in the opposite and wrong direction. But, we have a president right now who's prepared to fight on a national level to do something with gun violence and to reduce the gun violence death rate. You can't overstate the importance of that, of the executive actions that he took a few weeks ago, of his talking about it in the speech the other night. We're on the right track.
In 2019, Florida passed the bill to arm teachers. Nothing's come of that. And the likelihood of Florida doing anything else appears very unlikely right now.
So in 2018, we actually passed gun safety in Florida 3 weeks after the Parkland shooting. Red flag laws, raised the age of 21, instituted a waiting period, really good, important things. As part of that, we also started, there was an arming of resource officers in the schools. 2019 was a step in the wrong direction. It's one thing to have armed security. It's another thing to have armed teachers. Now, to get an armed teacher requires a lot of effort, requires training, but it's still a horrifically bad idea. It won't be long before kids know who the teachers are. They carry arms in schools where there are armed teachers. We read reports across the country where they do have armed teachers, of teachers leaving weapons out. We just know it's inevitable in schools where there are armed teachers, where a teacher finds themselves in the middle of a confrontation, maybe between students, and they pull out their weapon. And what armed teachers does is introduce guns into an environment where they don't belong and where they didn't once exist, to solve a problem that is thankfully incredibly rare and solvable in other ways, and that is the mass school shooting. What happened to my daughter is not a common occurrence. It was also a very preventable occurrence had others done their jobs beforehand. And so arming teachers doesn't solve mass school shootings, but it introduces guns into the everyday environment of education. That's not a good thing.
So would we be better off pushing something to teach teachers or about the mental illness problem, which is what had? How we got hold of a weapon is still unbelievable. And as you know, the statistics show, most shootings, mass shootings, are not done with an AR-15 or an assault type
Correct.
rifle. They're done with a gun with a high high number of bullets that they can carry. How do you do that? How do you stop it?
Well, so there was a couple of different parts to your question, and I think the first part had to deal with mental health.
Yes.
And so, listen, we there is not always a connection between an identified mental health issue and a shooter. So we can't say it's always a function of someone with a mental health issue, but oftentimes it is. This country has a problem with the way we deliver mental health services. It is a problem. We've been on a slow-moving freight train now for 20 something years in the wrong direction with how we deal with the mentally ill and how we keep taking funds away from how we deal with that population. And so there's big questions there that I think require some big solutions. But that doesn't solve the issue of gun violence, because we're not the only country with a mental health issue, but we have this massive gun violence problem. To get to your question, and I think you're focused on schools, there are several things we need to do. A, we need to get behind safe storage as a country. We need to pass strong laws, not just encouraging people to lock up weapons, but holding them liable and accountable if they don't. That's number one. Number two, we should be changing the age of purchase for weapons and ammunition to 21. There's too many emotional growth factors that take place amongst high school kids. They shouldn't have the ability to buy this stuff. But in too many states, Florida included, when my daughter was killed, the age was less than 21. The other thing I believe firmly, and I'm fighting for, because you're right about weapons. And the truth is, many of these weapons are already on the streets. It's not like someone has to go out and buy it. They may get it from dad who left it unlocked. They may steal it. They may get it from a friend. And what they do is they simply walk into a store and they buy the bullets. Because while you may not be allowed to buy a weapon in this country, so you have to steal it, borrow it, or get it from someone else, anyone who's a prohibited buyer of a weapon is also prohibited from buying the ammunition. But there's no requirement for a background check on ammunition. So I believe firmly we should require background checks on ammunition. If you are a prohibited purchaser, you walk into a store to buy the bullets, it is illegal, but nobody checks. And so these kids who get these weapons, again, unlock, steal, whatever, they walk into the stores to buy the bullets. We can put a stop to that with background checks.
That's a lot of paperwork and a lot of policing. Just, say you're a gun enthusiast and you like to go shooting once a week, once a month, whatever, and you buy 100 rounds, you use them up, you got to buy another 100 rounds, and you're not the only one buying it. So, who's going to keep doing all these checks? And there isn't even a system set up.
So there are different ways of doing it. Okay, and I'll give you an example of Connecticut. Connecticut actually has a card. You pass a background check, you get a card. It's good for the year. You go in, with that card, you can buy your ammunition or a gun. Okay. And so there are ways to do this. Background checks don't need to be a lot of paperwork. We live in a digital world. Okay. The truth is, there's even mechanisms now to make all of this stuff digitally traceable if the gun manufacturers and retailers weren't opposed to it for a lot of different reasons. there's ways to do this, and if it's all in the context of wanting to save lives, wanting to reduce the gun violence death rate, wanting to reduce the instances of gun violence, we should be doing everything we can to find these solutions. Nobody's saying to legal lawful gun owners, you shouldn't have the right to go do what you want to do. Um, Most legal lawful gun owners, the vast majority, agree that we should have roadblocks in place where we can prevent predictable tragedies. I use Florida as the example all the time. We did pass gun safety in Florida. Red flag laws, raising the age 21, waiting periods. There's not a single legal lawful gun owner who spends 1 second thinking about the laws we passed in Florida because it doesn't impact them. And we can do this. It's not about, there's nobody's right that is at risk, but we can save lives.
Fred, let me say I greatly admire your tenacity in this issue. And I know that recent polls have shown pretty overwhelming support for some kind of legislation coming out of Washington about the control, use, regulation of guns. But, you know, in the aftermath of mass shootings, and there have been many since the event that you unfortunately and your family went through, the Congress hasn't moved any legislation. They talk about it, they move on. It's like climate change, you know, climate change will save people's lives. They talk about it and they move on. You know, in the face of that, which I call the non-action at the highest levels, how do you keep going? Where do you, and I'm going to use the name of your book, where do you find the helpers?
You know, listen, I appreciate the question. The House has passed legislation, so the bottleneck has been the Senate. Um, I have a feeling the Senate, at some point this year, to start passing legislation that Americans have voted for, is going to break the filibuster. I think it's coming. I'm not sure what the issue is that will do it, and I think the issue of guns could end up being the issue. It's going to happen. This stuff that the House has passed and that I believe in is going to come to a vote in the Senate this year. It's going to happen. So, you know, listen, I find the helpers because I've been across this country. I've met people across this country who want this done, who believe, who are gun owners, but also understand the risk if we do nothing. I've met with legislators. I've helped to get people elected. This is the year. It's going to get done this year. I don't want to wait till next year. You have another election year next year. It's waiting too long. This is the year, and I firmly believe it's going to happen. And here's another reason why nationally movement has to happen. Because you do see a variety of states. Texas just passed a slew of laws making permitless open carry the law. But even worse than that, they passed a law saying people can take their weapons into their hotel rooms, store them there, doesn't matter if they're locked or unlocked, and that hotels cannot have policy against it. And so what they basically did is they passed a law putting people at risk. They get to wash their hands of it. They won't be sued. But when the shooting happens, and it will, the businesses will get sued. And so all of a sudden, the business community needs to wake up because what legislators are doing is passing the risk off to them. Florida is in the process of looking at a variety of ways to do the same thing as we speak. So this stuff is going to have to be handled at a national level because if you don't, you're only as safe as your closest border. And I have every confidence that this president, this House, and this Senate intend to do it this year.
Ever since the shooting and the movement started, the students at Parkland have been exceptionally vocal, well-spoken, etc.
Yeah.
Years later, with nothing significant happening, what is their mood?
Listen, the students are amazing. Now, many of those original March for Our Lives kids have done what they should have done, and they've gone on to college. They are going to be our future leaders of this country, and they need to get their education done, and they're doing that. There's other leaders who have stepped in to fill those voids, and there are other student groups that have actually come out of it. I will tell you, listen, I'm a dad of a 20-year-old. I should also have an 18-year-old daughter here with me. And when the shooting happened, my kids were 16 and 14. I thought this device here was destroying our kids. I thought they spent their day plugging away and they didn't know how to communicate, like most of us adults. And we were wrong. Not only do these kids know how to communicate, they are fierce in what they want. They know what they want. They are fierce in asking for it. And this device that I thought was destroying them is their weapon. They use this to communicate, to strategize, and organize in ways we can't keep up with. So I will tell you, I just did a podcast with a bunch of kids last week, and it's a national group. They are motivated. They are energized. They are ready to lead. They have to grow up a little bit. They have to get their education done. But as a country, I think we're going to be okay as these kids step up to leadership roles.
The Supreme Court this week
Yeah.
decided that they will hear a New York case on the constitutional right to carry guns outside home. Now, it's been more than a decade since the Supreme Court has issued any major opinion on gun control. Given what you said earlier, and the fact that we have a conservative court now, is this your best and maybe last chance to change things?
Well, listen, the Supreme Court at the moment scares the daylights out of me. While I do believe we can and will pass legislation, I am really concerned about what will happen in that court. I think you're all familiar about my presence at the Kavanaugh hearings. And when I was there and attempted to shake his hand, I wanted to say one thing to him. You're a dad like me who lives in a community similar to Parkland. This could have happened to your family. And I hope you remember that when it comes your turn to have to rule on an issue around guns. That's all I wanted to say to him. As we all know, I never got the chance. But the court is in a very conservative place right now. It's going to have, I believe, repercussions that will impact the election that comes after that. I share the fear you just laid out. I have it. This is the year to get this stuff done. Now, they may put out a ruling that surprises me because it doesn't do what I fear. But if it does what I fear, then you have to go back and maybe file lawsuits to try and get a different decision somewhere down the road or pass legislation it shouldn't come to this. We as a nation have to come to a place to acknowledge where nobody's trying to impact the rights of legal lawful gun owners. But we have to take the steps required, whatever they are, to keep weapons out of the hands that we can predict are going to attempt to harm themselves or others. You know, we're going to make mistakes. There's too many weapons out there. Shootings will still happen, but we can make them less.
Fred, you talked about this is the year where you're confident that with the Democratic Congress and a Democratic favorable administration for your cause, maybe you make some progress. Let's talk about a couple of specifics. Do you see there's any chance of getting the assault type weapons ban reinstated?
So specifics, I don't think that happens this year. I wish it did.
What about banning high capacity magazines?
I think that is a possibility, but I do believe that the likelihood is the things that will happen this year are going to be background checks, are going to be red flag or extreme risk protection orders. Um, I also believe that the efforts to deal with ghost guns are going to have a lot of activity this year. I listen. I can tell you what I wish for. I wish banning high capacity magazines and assault weapons was going to happen this year. I don't think so. I think the truth is the fight over those will just prevent other things that definitely will save lives from happening. And I am all for taking whatever chance we have on things that will save lives and that can get broad support.
Well, let me ask you this. Part of the problem here is the two sides that are deeply entrenched in their position, the gun rights, don't touch my guns people, then the gun safety reform people. The problem is they can't really talk to each other. They talk past each other a lot. And there's a narrative on the other side that says guys like Fred Guttenberg want the government to come after your guns. What can you say to win that argument in terms of just the speaking space? What can you say that you can assure people you're not coming after their guns?
You know, after my daughter was killed, I actually went out of my way to make it clear I actually am not calling for a ban on assault weapons. I didn't, because I wanted to focus on all these other things that were pragmatic and that could save lives. Where I changed, and back when Jamie was killed only just over 3 years ago, the messaging from the gun lobby was assault weapons, the reason, or the AR-15, okay, you know, they don't like when I call it an assault weapon. The AR-15 is for sport and hunting. The problem was they started showing up at government buildings and they started showing up at protests and people started dying as a result of that. And so, and they were the same people who told me that they use these for sport and hunting were the ones that were showing up carrying them over their shoulder now as a form of intimidation. That's what flipped me on the AR-15. It wasn't what happened to my daughter. It was the steps, the things that happened next. That said, here's what I would say to answer your question, okay? Because I don't claim to be the smartest bulb in the box and to have all the answers. But I know the three things I want to accomplish. I want to lower the gun violence death rate. I want to lower the instances of gun violence. And I want to lower the severity of gun violence injuries when they happen, okay? Because nobody is coming to take everybody's guns. So gun violence injuries will still happen. So those are the three things I want to accomplish. And when I talk to gun owners about wanting to do those three things, every time we actually find ourselves in a conversation about how we can do that, okay? Because I am not the guy saying, let's take everybody's guns out of their house. And honestly, everyone in the gun safety movement that I know also isn't doing that. We are trying to do things to save lives. The rhetoric that says any gun safety is a gun grab is just not true. It's a lie. And so I just, you know, you and I have spoken before, Bob. I reject that rhetoric completely because all that it does, because it is dishonest, but it creates a lot of emotion. And so, you know, I don't go there, but I will talk to people about how to achieve the three goals that I laid out.
See, I think part of the problem is we're in an atmosphere now politically where the truth no longer matters necessarily. If you can make your argument with the loudest bullhorn in your own set of facts, that prevails. And I think what you're up against in many cases is people are selling this argument to like-minded folks saying they're coming for your guns.
I know.
I mean, gun sales are up, right? Gun sales were up big in 2020. So
you know why, right? Do you know why?
Well, I'd like to hear your explanation.
Yeah. So at the start of COVID, when we were going into the shutdowns, the last administration left gun shops as an essential business. So while almost every business in the economy had to shut down, except for things medically related and food related, gun shops were able to stay open. And when you combine that with the economic anxiety that people were having over COVID and other forms of anxiety over COVID, gun sales spiked. It's called the COVID gun surge for a reason. Okay. And unfortunately, the consequences of that are things we as a nation are going to have to live with now for years, because it wasn't like it was a little bit of an increase. It was a huge, dramatic increase last year, and it was by design. We need to deal with that.
If anybody has a question on the call, if you want to just raise your hand, I'll try to get you in. Meanwhile, let's just take one more trip through the panel. Mark, Larry, you guys?
How do you battle the financial millions of dollars that the pro-gun people have? You know, your group is maybe louder than them, but they've got the money that apparently, for want of a better term, is helping sway the voter, the legislators.
Well, listen, the gun lobby was well financed. The NRA right now financially is a mess. Their bankruptcy was a charade. It was a fraud, and now anyone who's been paying attention to that sees that. But they're a mess, and they were the best financed amongst a lot of gun groups. Legislators are no longer fearful of what the NRA can do because they see what a mess they are, and the gun safety groups, listen, we're unified, we're organized. There is money on this side as well, but to me, what I am hoping to do, I am reaching out to corporations right now across this country. I am trying to organize the business community to finally take a stand here, because the business community is going to be the most impacted by gun violence going forward, because the risk, the financial risk, the lawsuits that follow are all going to be at businesses. These legislators who are passing laws, for example, in Texas, when the hotel shooting happens, it's going to be that hotel operator that gets sued, not the legislator who passed the law. Business owners need to be paying attention to what's happening. They need to start having clear policy for their business, for just make sure their employees are safe, their customers are safe. I think getting businesses engaged in this is the difference maker, and I'm working hard to do it.
Is there anybody on that point, Fred? Is there anybody in the gun business willing to be a responsible partner with you, or is that just a non-starter?
If there is anybody in the gun business willing to be a responsible partner, they haven't introduced themselves yet.
I mean, you can see that could be a real difference maker. I mean, I'm serious. If you could get somebody from that side to say, look, we also care about the same things that Fred's trying to prevent here.
I'll give you an example of someone, okay? One of my best friends is a police officer, and I talk about him in the book, who identified my daughter. He's actually, we all know the documented stuff that Broward Sheriff's Office screwed up with. But another police department, Coral Springs, which is nearby, they saw Broward Sheriff's Office failing, and these 3 police officers from Coral Springs went in without gear, just their handguns, preparing to shoot or be shot, but they knew every second mattered. They were heroic. My friend was amongst that group of 3. I tell you this because he's horrified by the fact that his rifle was tucked away safely in his trunk, and he didn't want to take the extra seconds to grab it, so he didn't. He has since devised a lock that allows it to be kept in the car. Law enforcement now across the country is buying it, and they're developing a civilian version of it. So to all these folks on the other side of this who say, I just want to take everyone's weapons away, I'm actually doing everything I can to help him promote this lock. Why? Because it saves lives, and he is doing this in a responsible way because these weapons need to be locked up. There are people out there developing smart gun technology and smart locks. They are trying hard to get greater, notice within the industry, but the industry doesn't want to go there yet. Amongst the major manufacturers, they're not gonna join. They just aren't. It's the reason why I want to sue them, which I'm not allowed to do because of a federal law called PLACA. But I want to put those CEOs on the stand. I want them to say how they made the decisions they made, what they knew, and why they did nothing to go ahead and take the steps to ensure their guns wouldn't be used to commit violence. Maybe after we get them on the stand and we have that ability to put them under oath, some of them will change their mindset and say, we need to be part of doing more for gun safety, but they're not there yet.
Well, this is, as you say, maybe a pivotal year. Iris, do you have a question? If you do, unmute your microphone and please go ahead.
Good point. I actually have two. Okay.
Hi, Iris.
The first one is, I guess I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand the legality of it. But if someone is in a hotel as a guest and they have a knife and they kill someone with that knife, is the hotel responsible?
So we're talking only about Texas, where this law was just passed. And the answer to your question is, listen, the hotel can be sued. Whether or what the outcome of a lawsuit like that would be, I don't know. What's different here, okay, is the state of Texas just passed a law specific on guns and what hotels can or can't do, allowing you. In the past, you weren't able to bring your weapons into the hotel. We saw what happened in Las Vegas. They just passed a law saying that patrons now could, and that a hotel cannot have a policy against it, and that they don't need to be locked up. So yes, if there's a shooting in a hotel, okay, these hotels are going to be the ones to get sued. It's not going to be the legislator. So the important point here is these legislators are passing laws that are putting businesses at financial risk, and businesses need to step up and say, that's not okay with us.
Have there been cases of hotels being sued if somebody got shot or knifed in a hotel?
No, this Texas just did this last week.
Oh, I understand that, but how about other places? Even though there's no.
Well, the answer to your question is businesses where shootings happen are getting sued and settling all the time right now.
Oh,
yeah, it's happening all the time. I, on the other hand, because my daughter got shot in a school, the ability to have a civil lawsuit with any meaningful recovery is much more complicated because schools and government entities have all sorts of statutory caps, and you can't sue them the way you would sue a business. But if you get shot in a business, yeah, your ability to sue and is ever present, and these lawsuits are happening. And at some point, insurance companies are going to start pricing that risk because it's happening more frequently than it used to happen.
I think we have a question also from Jeff Margolis, and we're going to wrap this up pretty quickly, Fred, to honor your time. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks, Fred, for being on with us this afternoon. I
Jeff.
spent my entire working career in public education, from middle school up through university. What should school districts be doing now to prevent another Parkland situation?
Well, number one, my daughter's murderer literally walked into the school. He walked through an open gate. He knew when the gates were supposed to be closed, but that they weren't getting closed, and he walked in. So the first things they need to do is they need to control their points of entry and make sure they're secured. That's number one. I do believe that glass ought to be bulletproof. I do believe that there should be silent panic alarms in schools, which, by the way, one of the Parkland parents, Lori Alhadeff, has really been fighting hard for that across the country. New Jersey's already put it in place, and Florida passed it last year. So you'll see silent panic alarms in schools now. I do believe that we ought to have a level of SROs, yes, armed, their security, appropriate to the size of the student population. There's a variety of things that can be done. There should be a functional camera system that is not on a time delay. Again, I say these things like you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Except these things weren't happening in the school where my daughter was killed. I think it was like a 7-minute delay. So people didn't even know what was happening until after it was already long done. There's so many steps schools can take to protect students from the potential risk of this, and they need to. Here's my fear. We turn schools into not armed, but into a locked fortress. So maybe the bad guys can't get into the school anymore. The problem is when people get let out of school, you see thousands of kids, they march out of schools, they walk through parking lots, maybe across the street to their cars or whatever. They're no longer protected. And I always think, what if this kid didn't get into the school the day my daughter was killed? Because my son and my daughter always walked out together. What if he was waiting in the parking lot? So that's the reason why I also believe the ultimate answer to your question is to deal with the issue of guns.
I think we have to leave it there. Fred, we greatly appreciate you sharing your personal experiences, as sad as they were. We admire your courage in speaking out on the issue. And more importantly, if you're willing in the future to come back to visit us again on Roundtable, we would welcome you back.
Let's stay in touch.
All right. We wish you well.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
We welcome now to Roundtable Luis Valdes. Luis is a former police officer, and currently he is the Florida State Director for Gun Owners of America. He's a staunch supporter, as you might imagine, of the Second Amendment, and he's a strong advocate for gun rights. Luis, we welcome you to Roundtable. Please take just a minute to tell us a little bit, and I mean just a minute, about yourself and your organization, and specifically explain to me something you said before, and that is that you believe the Second Amendment should not be subject to limitations. So let's start there.
Thank you for having me. As folks here know, I'm Luis Valdes. I'm the Florida State Director for Gun Owners of America. We are a national gun rights organization, and we have been labeled by former Representative Ron Paul as the no compromise gun lobby in Washington, D.C. and across the country. We are strong advocates for the Second Amendment in terms of protecting and advancing those rights across the country and here in the state of Florida.
You told me when we talked once, when I said to you, well, aren't there some common sense restrictions that your group would accept? And I think you said to me, you can't compromise what was essentially a God-given right. What did you mean by that?
The Second Amendment is an inalienable right. These are rights that you're born with. A common misconception that a lot of people get when it comes to constitutional rights is they look at the Constitution as if it's a document that grants rights. All the Constitution really does, it enumerates rights. It lists certain rights that we have as individuals that the federal government and the state government cannot trample on. And that's our belief, that's our stance, and that's what we do. We make sure that the Second Amendment, as all amendments, cannot be trampled on. It's just as important as the First, as the Fourth, and as the Fifth, and as all the others.
But just to clarify, then I'm going to turn it over to Larry. Some of the amendments you mentioned, like let's take the First Amendment and free speech. There frankly are some limitations on that, and you're well aware of what those are. So why can't we apply the same kind of standard to the Second Amendment?
The Second Amendment, in my opinion, as well with the First Amendment, are both crucial. And the idea that there can be limitations on the First Amendment, I think that's also wrong. I don't think there should be limitations on the First Amendment. Every individual has the right to freely speak their beliefs and to practice their beliefs, just as every individual has the right to not listen to someone. I'm right now exercising my First Amendment rights. You have the right not to listen to me, just as I have the right not to listen to you. And when it comes to the Second Amendment, I have the right to possess and own and carry firearms, and I have the right to defend myself. But those rights do not cross over when it comes to committing a violent act against an individual, which is the same case with the First Amendment. I don't have the right to cause slander and to besmirch you or to go after you in a way with the First Amendment. But the thing is, that's not infringing on the First Amendment. That's not limiting the First Amendment. That's just an understanding as a society, as a free people, that we have to respect each other.
Larry?
Liz, thanks for joining us. You know, I have to apologize, but when I think about gun rights advocates, I immediately think of the NRA, which is, as you know, a huge organization, and its membership is significantly larger than yours, but your membership is very passionate and very vocal. What are the differences between Gun Owners of America and the National Rifle Association?
GOA was founded in 1975 by NRA members. We actually have over 2 million members across the country and even more supporters than that. So we're not a small organization by any means. The main difference between the NRA and us is we are strictly a Second Amendment rights advocate organization. We don't use our time and our resources for, and I don't mean to, and I say this as an NRA member myself, we don't use our resources to go after things or push causes that don't directly involve the core tenets of the Second Amendment. We're hunters, we're target shooters, we're sports shooters, we're collectors, we're people that own and carry for self-defense. But like on some things, we don't believe that there should be mandated statewide training. If an individual wants to purposely get their own training, we support that. But the idea that mandated state training, for example, like here in Florida, if you want to get a concealed carry permit, you have to go through a mandated state training class. We don't think that's necessary. You don't require a mandated state training class to exercise your freedom of religion. You don't have to be an ordained minister to practice your theology. You practice your theology. So that's where we are, and that's where we might be different than the NRA.
But yeah, the NRA seems willing to compromise on a number of gun rights issues, like you know, firearm education and safety and training. But you guys seem to be quite dug in. So I'm wondering, are you a little bit or a lot more conservative than the NRA when it comes to this issue?
See, you say the word compromise as when it comes to training. Again, if an individual wants to, out of their own pocket and free time, go get training for better handling of a firearm, we fully support that. I fully support people seeking training, but the difference is I don't support it being state mandated because this is an inalienable right. Again, when it comes to other constitutional rights, we don't mandate that individuals get state training. That's the difference. So if in your opinion that's a compromise, then yes, we are very dug in. We do not agree that individuals should be forced to seek training for something that is an inalienable right. And I could further emphasize this. As a 15-year veteran law enforcement officer, some of the worst people that I've seen on the range were fellow cops that had years of experience and over hundreds of hours in training, and they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn.
I've read some recent polls, including those from Morning Consult, USA Today, Ipsos, the Pew Organization, and Gallup. And those polls all show seemingly overwhelming support for enacting restrictions on gun sales and gun controls. And the president had something to say last night about restrictions. Given these polls, and I'm sure you and your organization have seen them, does this put you out of touch with America?
Not at all. In reality, polls and statistics could be easily changed and manipulated
You
depending
mean
on
like
who.
presidential elections?
I'm not even touching that with a 10-foot pole. But in simple statistical polls, when you do poll research, if I'm going to conduct a poll and I want it to look a certain way or to skew it a certain way, it's real easy. I could go and ask 1,000 people in New York City that don't have a firearm, what are their views on gun laws? And most of them are going to say, oh, I'm in favor of harsher restrictions, because they grew up in a culture and an environment where it's extremely difficult for them to legally possess and own a firearm. Versus if I went to Montana or Texas or Utah and I conduct a poll of 1,000 people where most of them grew up around firearms, they grew up hunting, they grew up shooting, most of them would be vehemently against gun restrictions. But in reality, here's the honest truth. In the last year alone, we've had record gun sales. You've had Americans left and right buying guns for their own self-defense. And the largest growing segment of those people are minorities and women. Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and women are arming themselves for a reason. And it's one reason and one reason only. When seconds count, cops are minutes away. These people have seen across the country what it is when you rely on the government for self-protection. The government steps back and lets rioting and looting and violence take hold. You've had elected officials literally say, give people room for destruction. And the American people, they're tired of that. So yeah, you might have some polls from certain publications saying that they're in favor of more gun restrictions, but the buying public says otherwise. And you could literally look it up on the FBI's own statistics for background checks. Record sales have been happening this past year.
But we've got a country of now, according to the last census, 331 million Americans, and we've got over 400 million legal registered firearms. I mean, that seems to be a lot more guns than, as the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia.
A well-regulated militia meant the people. The people are the militia. The idea of well-regulated meant that the people were able to be equally armed and have access to the same arms that a standing army would have. When this country was founded, your average person had the same flintlock musket, had the same access to shot and ball that your average continental soldier had. And when the founding fathers again founded this country, the most technologically advanced piece of machinery involving publication was the printing press with movable type. They didn't dream of computers. They didn't dream of the internet. They didn't even dream of a Zoom call or YouTube or social media. But I bet you if you had them here today, they would be staunchly defending that right as they would as the idea of the average American having equal access to the same common firearms that are equipping law enforcement in the military today.
Thanks, Luis.
Mark?
Well, so let's go to my question, which is basically soldiers.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Soldiers are taught to how to use a weapon, how to strip the weapon, clean it, put it back together, and use it for fighting. So why am I, for example, not required to do the same? Why am I not told to get a class to go learn how to do all this so I can safely handle the gun?
Again, I could speak from personal experience as a former individual that even enlisted in the Army. Most people that go in the Army, they have horrible weapons training skills. The Army in itself, in terms of pistol combat training, is atrocious. The idea that your average soldier knows how to professionally handle a firearm is wrong. And if you actually look at the Army's policies for handling a firearm, they mostly have their soldiers carry, for example, just prior to the adoption of the SIG P320 as its service pistol, as the model M17, the original Beretta 92 FS, the model M9, most soldiers were instructed to carry with the hammer down, safety off, and not around in the chamber. Why? Because most soldiers didn't go through proper firearms training. But again, when it comes to the private individual, are you required to get training to practice your religion? Were you required to be an ordained minister? Did you have to go through a theology course to practice your religion? Did you have to go through any course to practice your right of free speech? No. That's the difference. You're talking about an institutional system, which is the military and law enforcement, versus a private individual freely exercising their rights. And again, as a cop, I could tell you that for the last 15 years, some of the worst people that I saw handling firearms were the fellow cops next to me on the range. They went through remedial training, and they're talking about hours and hours and hours of training where they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn.
I understand. And you keep mentioning the free press or the right of free speech.
Mm-hmm.
Free speech doesn't kill. Free speech does not fire.
Free words could very much kill.
Sticks and stones will break my bones. Words will never harm me. That's an old saying I learned growing up. Just so everybody knows, I own a gun. I bought a gun for protection because of an incident that happened 2 years ago. But I did go and get training. I did get licensed. I did all that.
Where did you get your training from, sir?
There's a gun range over here that I went to.
And how long was your training course?
To get to the CCW is 2 hours.
2 hours. So a state. No. Let me finish.
Go ahead.
So you did a state mandated 2-hour training course. Did you feel that mandated course was adequate?
For the CCW, probably.
Okay. But then you went on your own private.
Absolutely not.
But you went on your own.
I went to a friend who was a gun collector who has a lot of weapons, and I spent a lot of time with him, learning how to handle the gun, how to clean the gun, how to load it.
But you sought that training on your own accord. It wasn't mandated by the state. That's the difference. An individual we could either live in a regulated society or we could live in a free society. In a regulated society, there will never be safety. No matter how much regulation you try to enforce it, bad people will do bad things. In a free society, if you as an individual want to seek that training out of your own accord, you did it. And we have gun owners here in the state of Florida that do it all the time. We have training schools, we have instructors, we have entire businesses set up here in the state where people pay out of their own pocket for their own training. And there's a reason why, because they want to do that as a free people. The idea of mandating training is bogus, because mandated training is simply an excuse to prevent people from exercising their rights. Because if it comes down to cost, if I, as a private individual, and I only make X number of dollars, and it comes down to I could only afford the gun or I could only afford the training, and I'm working a minimum wage job, and I have a kid by myself in my house, and I live in a bad area of town, guess what? I'm going to buy the gun because I'm going to protect my kid. But the idea that you have to spend money as required by the state so you could freely exercise an inalienable God-given right that you're born with, that's wrong. Because you yourself, you said it, you went and you sought this training out of your own accord.
That's not a God-given right. It's one that was written into a piece of paper, which we now follow.
The founding fathers purposely,
nothing to do with it.
The Constitution is an enumerated list of rights. The Constitution does not grant rights. That is the difference, sir.
Louis, let me jump in here. I want to.
By all means, please.
It's an interesting discussion, but I want to ask you a couple of specifics. You say no compromise, no limitations, but let me ask you, what is wrong with something like universal background checks? What is wrong, and I'll give you plenty of time to answer here, what is wrong with reinstating the assault-style weapons ban? We tried that once in the 80s. It then went away when it was sunsetted. But what's wrong with those two things? Because I think if you look at most of the polls and you talk to people, They say we see all these mass shootings. Those two things seem to make sense to them.
The assault weapons ban was a complete failure. It was enacted in the 1990s, not in the 1980s. First
I'm
off,
sorry, 1990s.
Nope, not a problem. Yep. But if you want an excellent example, we could look at California. California started their assault weapons ban program in 1989. And last I checked, they have nothing but crime. Los Angeles is a crime-ridden city, as is San Francisco and their other major metropolitan areas. You could go to New York. New York is high in crime. You could go to Chicago. Chicago is the murder capital of the country. What do they all have in common? They have very restrictive gun laws. They have assault weapons ban. They have magazine capacity bans. Guess what? Criminals break the law. It doesn't matter. Last I checked, murder's been illegal since Moses came down the mountain with his 10 commandments, and people still do it. The idea that you could pass a law that bans possession of an item and that criminals will follow that law is laughable. The only people that are restricted from this is the law abiding.
But wait a minute. What's wrong with adding laws if we also do the corresponding addition of enforcement? You're saying the laws aren't being enforced. That doesn't make the law bad. It makes the application bad.
It makes it incredibly bad because as a cop, we're reactionary. Law enforcement isn't a preventative measure. It's a reactionary measure. All it does is 9 out of 10 times, every cop in his career will show up to the scene of a crime after a criminal act occurred, not before, after. And if you want to get into the nitty gritty in terms of constitutional rights, again, we either live in a free society or we live in a regulated society. If you want law enforcement to be preventative, then we're going to have a secret police like the Gestapo or the Stasi of Nazi Germany or East Germany, where everyone is monitored and tracked.
Okay.
But as a free society, no.
Let's talk about universal background checks.
By all means.
The aim of the universal background check is to know who's holding the weapons. Are you making the same argument that you can go ahead and put a call for universal background checks in the code?
Universal background checks don't work. Again, California has it. New York has it. Chicago has it. In Illinois, they have the firearms owner's identification card where every person has to get a permit to simply possess a firearm. Last I checked, criminals don't care. They get their guns through thievery. They get their guns through black market. They get their guns through illegal means. These laws only affect the law abiding. And worse, these laws are preventative measures put in place by authoritarian thugs in government that want to restrict the law abiding from defending themselves. Because the biggest difference is, again, if a population is reliant on government for protection, then government has power over them.
So I'm going to take some questions. I'm going to take some questions here if we have questions from the floor. But I guess you seem to be saying there's no perfect solution here. And I would stipulate that's probably right.
It's a multifaceted problem.
But so what do we do about the spate of mass shootings? What do we do about these awful events that we hear? I mean, as a reporter, I covered some pretty bad things. Aurora, Colorado, Sandy Hook, a few of these places. What do we do? Just throw up our hands and say, well, we just can't do anything about it?
No, by all means, no. There's multiple issues that we need to face. And we need to, as Americans, we need to look in the mirror first and foremost, and we need to agree that our entire mental health system is in complete shambles. Starting in the 1960s and leading up to the 1980s, I believe it was when Reagan was president that you had most of the state-run mental hospitals shut down. You had individuals that were clearly a danger to themselves and others released onto the public. And as a cop, the worst thing that I dealt with was people that were mentally imbalanced. And they were mentally imbalanced and they were on the street and they were homeless instead of getting the resources that they needed because the people in my own community, they didn't want to spend their tax dollars on these people getting the treatment that they needed. So what they do? They were left to fend to themselves as being homeless. And the final result was, as a law enforcement officer, we dealt with them because these people were mentally imbalanced. So they were mostly Baker acted, or they were arrested for petty crimes like shoplifting, disorderly intoxication, disorderly conduct, and they would be in and out of the revolving door system that is our criminal justice system.
So just to clarify, are you saying that a person adjudicated as mentally imbalanced or with a mental illness should not own a weapon? Because that is a restriction.
No, I didn't say that. I said that people that are mentally imbalanced, that are adjudicated mentally defective, should seek proper treatment.
But should they be allowed to own a weapon?
If they're cleared, then why not? Why is someone going to be barred for their life? If an individual has a temporary mental health crisis, you have people returning from the military, you have former law enforcement officers, you have people that they do suffer from PTSD, they do suffer from stress, they do suffer from traumatic injury, they do suffer from numerous complications in their life, but they get over it, they seek treatment, they receive therapy, they better themselves. Why are they going to be permanently disbarred from being able to defend themselves?
I want to take some questions from the gallery if we have some. In the meantime, I'll go back to Larry. Larry, I know you have some other questions. And if you do have a question, raise your hand and I'll try to get to you.
I believe
Rona has a
Saunders.
question.
Oh, I'm sorry. You got better eyes than I do. Thank you, Louis. Go ahead, Rona.
Hi. Okay. Yes, I do have a question. I understand the rights of the Second Amendment and everything you're saying, but tell me, for hunting or self-defense or any of the other target shooting, what is the purpose of an assault rifle? Why would somebody need an assault rifle unless their purpose was to kill people?
First off, an assault rifle is a made-up political term. There's no difference between an AR-15 and what is commonly called as an assault rifle or your common hunting rifles. And Ms. Saunders, are you versed in the history of firearms development and their actual mechanical designs?
No, I am not.
Okay, so I'm going to break it down real simple. What is commonly considered your common hunting rifle today, your bolt action rifle, that was developed from the World War I battle rifle, the model 1903 Springfield, the German Mauser Gewehr 98, the British Lee Enfield. At the turn of the 20th century, the most high-tech form of weaponry for the military was your bolt-action rifle. You had millions of service members return home from the war with either war trophies or, as companies like Remington and Winchester, when they were going back from a wartime production to a civilian production, they had all this tooling. So they made what was the common service rifle into a hunting rifle, and the bolt-action became extremely popular. In World War II, the common service rifle for the U.S. infantrymen was the M1 Garand, was a semi-automatic, gas-operated rifle. And semi-automatic is very simple. You load the thing, for every pull of the trigger, the action cycles, it chambers the new round, it goes off. And after World War II, again, the gun companies developed the same thing. They went from a wartime production to a peacetime production, and they took the same principles, the same operating designs, and they created, after World War II, some of the country's most popular hunting rifles. The Model 742 from Remington, you had the Model 742. From Winchester, you had the Model 100. You had other companies like HK out of Germany. They created the Model 970, so on and so forth. Ruger, they created one of the most popular plinking rifles in history of mankind, the Ruger Model 1022. So what a lot of people think as an assault rifle is just that. It's a common semi-automatic rifle. Because again, the same,
you need to kill something.
It doesn't matter.
Let me clarify.
No. But I'm going to answer both questions. So when you had people returning from Vietnam and the Gulf War and the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, the AR-15 became a very popular platform for hunting because it's very modular. My wife, who's 5'2" and weighs 110 pounds, she can't handle the common bolt action in 30-06 because it's heavier and it has a lot of recoil. But the AR-15, what everyone here is going to call an assault rifle, it's low recoil and it's very easily for her to handle because it weighs 6.5 pounds. Versus my Ruger Model 77 is a 12-pound rifle with a bull barrel and kicks like a mule in 30-06.
Why does your wife have to shoot 30 times and one time? Is that self-defense or hunting?
Because she does competition shooting where there's multiple targets on the range.
I'm asking why a normal person would need to be able to shoot 20, 30, 40, 50 times.
Why as a law enforcement officer was I equipped with an AR-15 with 30 round mags?
because you're not as well trained as you should have been, or you wouldn't have needed that much. But the average person isn't even close to that. So why do they need it? What self-defense are you protecting when you have somebody has a rifle that shoots 30, 40, 50 bullets? How is that self-defense?
Because bad guys sometimes come more than once.
Oh, okay. So sometimes they do one out of a case of 500, and 500 school shootings are the exception. So we should protect the
Every
one
law enforcement
person.
officer in this country is
Uh-huh.
mostly equipped with either a pistol that holds over 15 rounds of ammunition or an AR-15 with 20 or 30 round magazines.
That's
But
a
they have
police
to be-
officer.
The idea that they could be equipped with the same tools, but the private citizen is restricted from having access to the same tools for their own self-defense is a slap in the face of the common citizenry. If an individual,
we disagree.
no,
Hmm.
we disagree, but I want to clarify this.
Mhm.
If we as a society base our entire legal system, our entire system of government off the idea of equality, where we do not have different classes of people, where we do not have government bureaucrats and agents of the state that are granted more authority and more power than the average citizen, then that is a slap against the entire basis of our Constitution. Our country was founded on a simple principle that we are not going to have nobility, we are not going to have knights protecting nobility, and everyone is equal. If a law enforcement officer has access to an AR-15 and 30 round magazines, then the common citizen should. Because I could tell you this, as a cop, I was by myself in lots of parts of Florida, and that AR-15 would have been the only thing that kept me safe. And my wife, when she's alone, that AR-15 is going to be the only thing that keeps her safe when I'm away from my house. It is no different. We, as a guiding principle, as a belief in equality, the idea of simply because an individual is an agent of the state should have access to something while the private citizen doesn't is wrong. It is a complete travesty on the idea of equality for the average person.
Louis, I want to honor the time commitment that you've given us, and we're at about the half-hour mark. Larry, I think you might have had one final point you wanted to make, and then we're going to wrap this up, I think.
I wanted to go back to the issue of training, Luis. You
Yes.
said, I believe you said, that on the gun range, some of the worst shooters were cops.
Yes.
And were those cops, had they been trained?
Oh, yeah. They've gone through the
Okay,
academy. They were signed
okay.
off.
Okay. So some of the trained cops were the worst shooters on the range.
Mhm.
What does that make an untrained citizen with a weapon?
An untrained citizen statistically has a better chance because they personally seek their own training. Again, I'm not against training. I'm against the idea of mandating it because this is an inalienable right. If a private citizen wants to legally exercise their Second Amendment rights, they shouldn't be forced to seek training. They should have the option as a private citizen to seek training. That's where we have a distinction, and we have not a distinction, I'm sorry, a difference in opinion. I'm not against training. I pay out of pocket for my own training. I did it when I was a cop. I went through training classes that I paid for because my agency wouldn't sponsor me for it because they said, you know what, you had enough. But again, I did that out of my own volition. And the private citizen has that same right, that same ability. If they want to better themselves, as it comes to everything, they have the opportunity. But government mandated training is a waste of time. And I could give you fantastic examples because it's mandated by the state of Florida that a law enforcement officer has over 100 hours of training. And most of them, it's like taking a 3-year-old to the dentist. They're going to kick and scream and they want to get the hell out of it.
Are those 100 hours of training by the police, are they mandatory?
Yes, they're mandatory.
Okay. So why couldn't we make training for a gun owner mandatory?
Because a gun owner as a private citizen is a private citizen. An individual as a cop, he decided to be a cop and go through that profession. When you're a private citizen, you're taking...
Even though he doesn't have to be well trained in the use of his weapon.
Again, a private citizen is defending himself. That's the main issue. We are talking about inalienable rights. We're talking about enumerated rights in the Constitution. Again, were you mandated by the government to get training through an ordained ministry to practice your religious beliefs, or were you mandated by the government to get training to be a journalist and practice your First Amendment rights? Yes or no?
I think we've got to leave it there. I'll let Larry answer the question and then we'll leave it there. Mandated training to be a journalist.
Not that I ever had.
Then why is it right or wrong? Then why is it what it would be right to force someone to get training for one inalienable right, but not the other? Because
right.
are our rights all equal?
Because I don't think my typewriter had the ability to kill someone.
Last I checked, some of the most horrific murderers in the history of mankind, they didn't use a gun, they used their words. Adolf Hitler didn't pull the trigger, neither did Joseph Goebbels, but Goebbels, as the minister of propaganda, led many to their deaths.
And that's going to be a topic for a different day. Thanks to all of you for joining us today on Roundtable. Special thanks to our guest, Luis Valdes, and also to Fred Guttenberg, and of course to our panelists, Mark Young and Larry Doyle. If you're viewing this on the Press Club YouTube channel, do me a favor, make sure you hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up there, and then more importantly, tell your friends about it. Thanks again for joining us on Roundtable, and we will see you next time.